Hi, folks. Welcome back. Here we are with our next recorded lecture. I'm instructor Victor Fabiana Bundesguerra in this Philosophy 110, Introduction to Philosophy. Today, we're going to go ahead and finish up our discussion on Miranda Fricker, her ideas of epistemic injustice, particularly Chapter 2, Testimonial Injustice. So we talked about, some vocabulary in order to understand where she's coming from, right? And in particular, she's doing epistemology, the study of knowledge and how we know what we know, but she's also approaching it from a social standpoint, particularly a gendered standpoint of the gender, particularly of women, and how they often experience credibility deficits or testimonial injustice, where they're not given enough credibility. They're not giving enough seriousness to what they say. And this causes a bunch of harms to them. We're going to get into that today. But we saw the example last time, right, of the retrievals and how the women there were undergoing credibility deficits, according to Miranda Fricker. With that said, let's go ahead and continue with our slides. We do have a few more slides to go through. So, Chapter 2 is called Prejudice in the Credibility Economy. First, think about the title itself. Credibility is something you give or take in an economy. It's like a currency, it's transactional, and someone can overpay you, a credibility excess, but someone can also underpay you, right? They owe you money, they owe you credibility. In other words, credibility is sort of transactional. If you deserve a certain or merit a certain amount of credibility, you need to get a certain amount of credibility, or else you're being cheated, essentially. It's not fair. Fricker's ideas rely on the idea of stereotype and prejudice that we sort of defined earlier in the slides. So let's look at that more closely. Or we defined social power and identity power earlier, but we're going to go ahead and define stereotypes now. So according to her, stereotypes are widely held associations between a given social group and one or more attributes. Now, these can be either true or false. A prejudice, however, are judgments which may have a positive or negative valence or maybe emotion, you can think of them that way, and which display some typically epistemically culpable resistance to counter evidence owing to some emotional investments on the part of the subject. So again, the stereotype is just sort of the association, the belief itself, but the prejudice itself, or the prejudice is kind of like a step further. Has a sort of emotional aspect to it, a negative or positive valence. It's either a good thing or a bad thing. The stereotype, it's either a good stereotype or a bad stereotype, and then it becomes a prejudice. And finally, the prejudice is also kind of resistant to counter evidence or resistant to the facts. So let's focus on negative prejudices that rely on identity. So a negative, I know it's a bit of a mouthful, a negative identity prejudicial stereotype is, according to her, a widely held disparaging association between a social group and one or more attributes, where this association embodies a generalization that displays some, typically epistemically culpable, resistance to counter evidence owing to an ethically bad, effective investment. So if you, for instance, might have the negative identity prejudicial stereotype that women are bad at math, which is not true, by the way, of course, but you might have that prejudicial stereotype, or let's say someone has that prejudicial stereotype. That prejudicial stereotype is negative. They're bad at math. It's not a good thing. And people might be, this hypothetical person, might be invested in that. So even when they see they see a woman or many women in front of them being very good at math, they might downplay this evidence. That is, they're resistant to the counter evidence because they're invested in a bad way into the stereotype. In regard to gender, she says these particular stereotypes distort the hearer's perception of the speaker. So when the sexist person hears the woman or another woman talk about math, they are going to give their answer less credibility than someone else's, even if the woman might be right, as either unreliable, insincere, or incompetent. And again, we saw this again also with the retrievals, where they were given less authority over pain and they were being told that they're exaggerating. So far we have seen that testimonial injustice necessarily involves prejudice, a prejudgment on the basis of identity prejudice. At this point, there might be an objection, right? You might say, but when I mess up and don't give X person enough credibility, I'm not being prejudiced. And here's an example of maybe that sort of happening in real time, right? So suppose that you, a listener, judge a speaker as insincere, that they lack credibility because they're insincere, because they fail to maintain eye contact or give maybe too much of it, depending on your culture or wherever setting you're on. Maybe they frequently look around the room, they touch their neck, and they pause self-consciously mid-sentence. However, it turns out that the speaker is not being insincere. They're just really shy. They're just not very charismatic at all. And that's why they were doing all those weird things. In this case, she says, Miranda Fricker, their stereotype is that those who exhibit these traits are untrustworthy. And it is empirically supported to some degree. This is empirically supported to some degree by psychology, particularly in America, in the West. In which case, however, this is simply a matter of bad luck. This is not a matter of testimonial injustice. However, so if you were to do that, you're not a bad person. You're not being prejudicial or whatever, because there's evidence to support that, or at least some evidence to support that. However, when it comes to gender, they claim that that some feminine traits equal untrustworthy, or femininity means untrustworthy or incompetent or unreliable. Those claims are not empirically supported. So although you might not be prejudiced when it comes to maybe shy people doing those things, when it comes to women, if you're making those claims, even implicitly, you are being prejudiced. A good question to ask at this point, right, is what are exactly feminine traits? There are, of course, obvious ones, such as looking feminine, speaking with feminine or high-pitched voice, or a lot of prosody, a lot of fluctuation in your voice. Women do more of that. But are there also less obvious ones, less obvious feminine traits that people might suffer stereotypes for embodying those feminine traits? Something to think about. I don't have the answer to that, but you can maybe ponder that. So at this point, why do we sort of explicitly, right? Why do we explicitly care about this? We've seen examples of this with the retrievals. I've given you examples of this. But let's go ahead and try to actually conceptualize in words what actually is the wrong of testimonial injustice, what actually is messed up about giving a woman or anyone a credibility deficit. Well, according to her, there is a primary harm. There is a wrong to a person insofar as they are a knower. In regard to negative prejudice based on social identity, the person is essentially treated as a sub-knower, as a less worthy person or less worthy agent capable of knowing things. They are, in a sense, degraded qua knower. Carl Mills and his idea of personhood versus sub-personhood. For Charles Mills, Black people were treated as sub-people. They were less morally valuable. Miranda Fricker's here saying something similar. Women are treated as sub-knowers. They're treated as less valuable agents of knowledge, or carriers of knowledge, if you want to sort of speak that way. So a question to ask here is, right, is how might those given credibility exorcists also suffer injustice? All right, the men who are given too much information or too much credibility, they might also suffer some type of injustice, but their injustices are going to be a little different from the one that the women suffer, right? But there's also a secondary harm that women suffer when they are given a credibility deficit. And this one is kind of split up into two parts. There's the first one, you're just treated as a sub-knower. You're treated as a more incompetent, more insincere, or as stupider. But there's also a secondary harm. And this secondary harm has a practical harm, in which material and physical advantages, which are causes by the testimonial injustice and come to bite later. So the idea here is that your boss at work sees you, because you're a woman or whatever part of a group you are, as less reliable, less competent, and less sincere and less trustworthy because of your identity. When that happens, you're not being given a promotion at work. You're being evaluated poorly by your students for being a woman, which does happen, by the way. Being found guilty when one is innocent, losing reputation, losing friends, being incarcerated, even though you're found to be insincere in court. Sorry, I think even if you are found to be sincere in court. So all of these are material and physical harms that you would go through because you are not given enough credibility, which hurt you, which hurt your wallet. And lastly, there's also an epistemic harm. Just as testimonial injustice might distort the listener's view of you when you're speaking, so other people might give you less credibility. But if there's enough testimonial injustice over time, it might distort your own view of yourself as a knower. You might start thinking, maybe I am dumb. Maybe I am untrustworthy. Maybe I'm not as reliable as I thought. You might start saying things such as, maybe it's all in my head. I guess I'm not as smart as I thought I was. Maybe I just need to stop being so paranoid and crazy. If you, Miranda Fricker would say, are a woman and you've said those things to yourself, you have essentially internalized the testimonial injustice. You have essentially internalized the epistemic harm to the point that other people no longer need to give you credibility deficits. You can just do that by yourself because you've internalized it already, which is, quite sad. So there's an example that she gives, Miranda Fricker, an untenured philosophy professor friend, a Chicana Latina woman who fell prey to undermining complaints from a white male graduate teaching assistant. She believed, and according to the story, had good grounds to believe, that his complaints were utterly unfounded. Yet Alkoff, another philosopher, tells how this young professor received precious little credibility from her colleagues until their senior white professor suffered the same sort of complaints from the students. This senior professor then concluded that the student didn't really have a problem with my friend, but with authority in any form. And the rest of her colleagues then changed their view of her and made an effort to accept her back into the fold. However, she did so for 2 years of anguish and self-doubt because of this roadblock in her career. Which sucks, which is unfortunate. Epistemic harm, Miranda Fricker says, affects women of all classes and all backgrounds, simply in virtue of being a woman. So the takeaway question that I have for you is, how common do you think? Because Miranda Fricker thinks it's very common, extremely common. But how common do you think testimonial injustice is to women in America? Have you suffered it? Has a woman you know suffered it? Maybe a different identity group has suffered it? Tell me about it. But with that said, folks, that's all for today. I'll see you folks next time. Bye-bye.